talked about last time. Are there any questions? So on kind of types of hormones. Anybody remember what are the two major categories for types of hormones? So about two categories, broad range. Steroids are a type of, so lipid-soluble. Steroids are a type of lipid-soluble hormone, and then the other, water-soluble, right? Okay, which one of those has a receptor that's membrane-bound? Water-soluble. Where's the membrane, or where's the membrane? Where's the receptor for the lipid-soluble hormones? Intracellular, within the cell, right? And does that make sense to folks why that receptor can be in the cell? So lipid-soluble hormones, is that cell membrane much of a barrier to it? No, right? So it can get past the cell membrane. However, water-soluble hormones, that's a bit of a challenge, right? Okay. So what we'll do is continue our discussion there of the endocrine system. Hey, welcome, Damien. Good to see you. All right, so like you guys said, steroid hormones are the lipid-soluble ones, and like I said, you don't have to memorize these structures. But here, all of these steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, so they have a similar chemical structure, right? And cholesterol is fairly lipid-soluble, and therefore, if something has a similar chemical structure, it's likely to have a similar chemical features. So where are the receptors for these hormones? Not surprisingly, they'd be found where? Inside the cell, intracellular, absolutely, okay? And so these are just a few examples. We're going to talk about these in more detail as we talk about the endocrine system, right? So here, lipid-soluble hormones, we didn't talk about this slide yet, but it's basically a recapture of what I drew on the board, right? So here we have steroid hormones that are lipid-soluble, that can bind to a receptor that's within the cell, so it's intracellular. And a lot of times when that hormone binds to the receptor, it gets translocated into the nucleus, where it predominantly is turning genes on and off. So for these hormones that we talk about, a lot of genes get turned on and off, and then also proteins get turned on and off. Do you think that's easily reversed? Does that take some time to reverse? So if you have a whole bunch of genes being turned on and off and proteins being turned on and off, is that going to take a long time to reverse? Yeah, it takes a long time for this to go back to the state it was before that hormone stimulated the cell. So here, the effects of hormones, are they long-lasting or are they short-acting? What do you guys think? They're long-lasting, absolutely. So when we talked about like neurotransmitters, the autonomic nervous system, that was relatively short-acting, right? So here we have the intracellular receptor for these. Now, here's some the new information that we're starting off on today is what stimulates hormone release? Like what we saw before with a lot of chemical messengers, there has to be a stimulus behind it. So one mechanism is that there's a detector or a receptor that detects some sort of stimulus, and then it directly causes that cell to release the hormone. So an example of this is the parathyroid gland, which is endocrine tissue within the thyroid gland, which is also endocrine tissue. They kind of sit like little buttons in the thyroid gland. And if you remember back to biology 231, when you talked about calcium homeostasis and say bone metabolism, parathyroid hormone was involved with calcium, blood calcium homeostasis, right? So here, if blood calcium is low, and that's detected, parathyroid hormone gets released, right? And what is going to respond to parathyroid hormone? What are some of the target tissues for parathyroid hormone? So kidneys is one. Bone's a major one, right? Because remember, bone is like a depository of calcium, right? So if blood calcium's low, do we want to make a withdrawal or do we want to make a deposit from that bone bank or the calcium bank in bone? What do you guys think? Withdrawal, right? And so what types of cells is parathyroid hormone stimulating? So we have osteoblasts and osteoclasts there. Osteoclasts, remember osteoblasts? They're the builders. They build bone. They deposit calcium into bone. Clasts break down bone, right? They're taking calcium out. They're resorbing calcium. So if they take calcium out of the bone, then it's going to raise the blood calcium levels and we maintain homeostasis. Everybody follow that? Okay. So one mechanism is kind of direct detection and then release of that hormone. A second one we've already encountered, right? When we talked about the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, right? So here we had the nervous tissue releases a neurotransmitter, okay, which causes these cells to release their hormone. If it's a hormone, it gets released into the bloodstream, right? That's by definition what a hormone is, a chemical messenger that gets released into the bloodstream. So here, what are some of the chemical messengers that are released from this part of the adrenal gland? Epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So we saw this before already. The part of the adrenal gland that's doing this is called the medulla. So if you think of the adrenal gland as kind of like a hat, the interior part of the hat's the medulla, which is releasing these catecholamines, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine. The outer portion of that hat is called the cortex. So if you remember when we talked about the brain, when we talked about the cerebrum, what was the outer portion of the cerebrum called? What do we call that? What's that? It is the cerebral cortex, right? So here cortex is just referring to the outer portion of it, right? So here, this adrenal gland has an adrenal cortex, which we'll talk about, and then the interior part of it's the adrenal medulla. So there's kind of two separate areas of the adrenal gland. The medulla is involved with the nervous stimulation of release of these catecholamines into the bloodstream, right? So is this going to be something that we consider being released in response to, say, resting and digesting? Or fight or flight? Fight or flight, absolutely. Okay, so this is the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. The last mechanism, which is probably the most common mechanism we'll see for how hormone release is controlled, is that we have other hormones that control hormone release from other endocrine structures, right? So here, we have some hormones that get released from hypothalamus. They're going to cause hormones to be released from the pituitary gland that are then going to cause hormones to be released from other endocrine or gland structures. So it's a bit like a relay, where one endocrine tissue versus another endocrine tissue is going to pass off that information. All right, everybody following me on that? Is that clear, the three mechanisms there? Any questions on any of those? Yeah, go ahead. So here, what gets released from this sympathetic neuron is going to be a neurotransmitter because it's a paracrine mechanism, right? And when those cells that have the neurotransmitter receptor receive that signal, they release the hormone into the bloodstream. You following me on that? Awesome. Any other questions? Making sense to folks? All right. We're going to talk a lot about these mechanisms. And I'll say right now that the extra credit opportunity in a lab also helps you understand how these different hormones regulate each other. So I encourage you to spend time in the lab looking at these. like with the special senses lab, the endocrine lab you guys are doing overlaps significantly with the content that we're discussing here in lecture. Okay, so kind of the first set that we're going to introduce of the endocrine structures are the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So remember that the hypothalamus is going to be up in here, and then it leads through the stalk to the pituitary gland. Up to this point, we just have discussed the pituitary gland as just one structure. And really, there's two structures for the pituitary gland. There's an anterior and then the posterior part of the pituitary gland. Let's talk about the posterior part first. So it turns out the posterior part of the pituitary gland has neurons whose cell bodies start off in the hypothalamus, and they extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary through this stalk. Okay? So what we say is that these neurons project to the posterior pituitary. So when I use that word project, do you guys understand what I'm saying? Okay? So here they start off here, the neurons in the hypothalamus project to the posterior pituitary, which means that hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary start their manufacturing here in the hypothalamus. Okay? Everybody with me on that? Okay. The anterior pituitary is slightly different. There's kind of this miniature highway system of blood vessels, we call a portal system, in which hormones from the hypothalamus get released into this mini highway system so they can travel down to the anterior pituitary. And then those hormones bind to their receptor to cause cells in the anterior pituitary to release their hormones into the bloodstream to be distributed systemically. All right? So there's kind of a miniature highway system. So if we had like a miniature highway system to link Bend and Redmond specifically, right? That's kind of what we're talking about between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. All right? So the mechanism for releasing hormones from the anterior pituitary relies upon hormones being released from the hypothalamus. Right? Everybody with me on that? Okay. All right, so this is pretty much what I was telling you about. The hypothalamus is physically linked. There's a portal system, which is a blood vessel network for the anterior pituitary, kind of like a miniature highway between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And then with the posterior pituitary, we have neurons that start off in the hypothalamus and project into the posterior pituitary, meaning that those hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, their manufacturing starts off in the hypothalamus. Any questions on kind of the organization here of the pituitary gland, anterior, posterior, relationship to the hypothalamus? Making sense to folks? Yeah? Okay. Seeing a lot of head nods, not a lot of head shakes, so that's good. All right. So, like I told you, the mechanism that's most common is that hormones control release of other hormones. And so here, we'll see that there's only really 2 hormones that come off of the posterior pituitary. A lot more come out of the anterior pituitary. And so that means that a lot of these hormones of the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary in particular, are regulated by hormones being released from the hypothalamus. Now, some of those hormones from the anterior pituitary are then going to target another endocrine gland. And then that endocrine gland is going to release their hormones, which have target cells. All right? But if we want to make sure that this system doesn't continuously increase the amount of hormones, we have to have some sort of mechanism to kind of slow it down when enough hormones have been released, right? We have to put some brakes on this system. Okay? So what do we talk about when we talk about homeostasis? Where we wanted to have some sort of feedback. What type of feedback would put the brakes on the initial stimulus? Negative feedback, right? So whatever that initial stimulus was, in this case it's going to be release of a hormone, the end result, which is also the end release of a hormone from an endocrine gland, should inhibit that original release of the hormone. And I'm going to draw something out in just a second to help with illustrating this. All right? So a lot of the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus have the word releasing in it. So if you see the word releasing in the hormone name, then that is a hormone that is coming from the hypothalamus. And that hormone is causing another hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary. A lot of the hormones of the anterior pituitary that are going to be stimulating another endocrine organ have the word stimulating in their name, right? So releasing hypothalamus, stimulating anterior pituitary. All right? Okay. So inhibiting and then also releasing hormones. Some hormones are putting the brakes specifically on some hormones, hormones being released. Most of them are actually stimulating. So here, example is growth hormone releasing hormone. So if it says growth hormone releasing hormone, where's that coming from? It's got releasing in it. Hypothalamus. Okay? And so here, there's a few instances where inhibitory hormones come from the hypothalamus. Right? So growth hormone inhibiting hormone is coming from the hypothalamus as well. Now, what is it releasing and inhibiting or what is it inhibiting or promoting the release of? What do you guys think? Growth hormone. Where's growth hormone coming from? Based upon what we talked about. So if GHRH and GHIH are coming from the hypothalamus, what's that next target on the relay system? Anterior pituitary, right? So anterior pituitary is releasing growth hormone. All right? Okay, so I'm going to draw a few things on the board to help you guys with looking at these systems, or what we call axes of the endocrine system. So when we have, say, the hypothalamus communicating with the pituitary, we can call that the hypothalamic pituitary axis. They just kind of mash the words together, right? Okay, so some terminology. All right, so some terminology here. So regular arrows here that have the regular, pointed end are going to be positive, meaning that they promote, stimulate, or activate. So they could be promoting the secretion of hormones. These arrows that have a block end, called block arrows, are negative in that they inhibit or they decrease or they antagonize release of hormones. Okay? All right? So if we wouldn't want to draw an axis or a system out for these hormones, and I encourage you guys to do this to understand if we disrupt the system, what's going to happen. All right? So when you guys are taking your exam, be sure to write this out. Drawing out is going to really help with keeping track of things. So it's difficult to keep track of things if you don't draw it out and you're just trying to do it all in your head. All right, so let's say that this hormone A gets released from a structure, and that causes release of hormone B from another endocrine structure, and that hormone B causes the release of, say, hormone C from another endocrine structure, right? So everybody with me on that? So here we're talking about releasing or promoting the release of, okay? Now, if we continue with this system, right, without putting the brakes on it, we're constantly going to get increases in hormone B and C and, A actually as well, right? So here, if we want to have negative feedback, we should take maybe the end product, like we saw with negative feedback in maintaining homeostasis, and that should inhibit the original stimulus. Right? So if I want to inhibit this original stimulus, which arrow should I use here? The negative one, the block arrow, right? So here, if I take this, right, so that final hormone actually, when it gets to a certain amount, can feedback inhibit A so that this system goes back to baseline. It self-regulates. Everybody with me on that? Okay? So let's say that this structure that's releasing A, let's make that the hypothalamus. All right? And so let's say that the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the release of a hormone from, let's say, the anterior pituitary. So let's make this structure the anterior pituitary. And why don't we make this last structure here, say, the adrenal cortex. All right, so we have hormone A that comes from the hypothalamus, which causes hormone B to be released from the anterior pituitary, which then causes hormone C to be released from the adrenal cortex. Everybody with me so far on this? Okay. Where are the receptors for hormone A? Where are they located? Which structure? Where are the receptors? What structure has the receptors for hormone A? Has to be a structure or an organ or a tissue that responds to hormone A. So which one's responding to hormone A? Anterior pituitary. Everybody see that? So here, in order for anterior pituitary to respond to hormone A, it has to have the receptors for it, right? Which structure has the receptors for hormone B? Adrenal cortex. So basically, whatever structure you're looking at has receptors for whatever hormone is upstream, right? So upstream, downstream, you guys following me on this? So if we think of this as kind of a flow, a relay, right? Okay. Now, which one of these structures has got a receptor for, say, hormone C of these three? So what was A? Hypothalamus. So why do you say hypothalamus? Yeah, we have feedback inhibition going on. In order for the hypothalamus to respond to this hormone C, it's got to have receptors for it. In this case, those receptors put the brakes on hormone A secretion, right? Everybody follow me on this? Okay. Now, it turns out when hormone C gets released from the adrenal cortex, if this is one of the final glands here, generally what happens is there's also other effectors, so other tissues that respond to hormone C. All right, everybody with me so far on this? Okay. So let's start replacing A, B, and C with actual hormones. right, so let's do cortisol. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid that gets released from the adrenal cortex. Now, anterior pituitary is releasing a hormone that causes glucocorticoids, including cortisol, to be released. Anybody know? I know we haven't covered it yet, but anybody know what that hormone is that gets released from the anterior pituitary to do this? ACTH. Why do we abbreviate it? Because it's adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's a mouthful. All right? Okay? So ACTH gets released here from the anterior pituitary. That's okay if you guys don't know that because we haven't talked about it a lot yet. Okay? ACTH. Now, in order for ACTH to be released, we have a hormone that's being released from the hypothalamus. Now, you may not know the exact name of this hormone, but if it's coming from the hypothalamus and causing a hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary, what word does it have to have in it? Releasing. So you know at least it should be some sort of hormone with the word releasing in it. All right. So it turns out, does anybody know this one? No, that's all right. So it's CRH, and there's a reason why we abbreviate that one too. That's corticotropic releasing hormone. So we just drew, and this is a mouthful, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortex axis, right? This whole system. Now the cool thing, once you draw it out, you can figure out what happens if something goes wrong. So this is how it normally functions. Now, what about if we have, let's do this. So what if we had an immune system problem where the immune system made antibodies, okay, that bound to the ACTH receptor in the adrenal cortex. And when it bound to that receptor, it stimulated it. So let's say these antibodies stimulate the ACTH receptor. Okay? So let's say that. All right? So if the antibodies are binding to this receptor and stimulating it, what's happening to the amount of cortisol? Is that going up or down? It's going way up. And so here, that means that we're going to be really stimulating a lot of the effectors. So I'm going to draw a really big arrow. I know that's not very good, but it's really big. Okay? What about this feedback inhibition arrow? Right? Are we going to increase that inhibition or decrease it if we have more cortisol? Increase it. Everybody see that? We have more cortisol. That means we're pressing on the brakes a lot more. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make this block arrow really big. Okay? We have a really big inhibition of CRH being released from the hypothalamus. So if CRH is being inhibited, what does that mean for this arrow? Should I draw it bigger or smaller? Smaller, really, really tiny. Yep. So really super tiny here. Right? Really tiny. Okay? If this is really tiny, what is that doing to the amount of ACTH released? Is that going up or down? Going down. So should I draw this arrow larger or smaller? Really tiny. Okay? Right? And so now you can see how the system was disrupted, right, in an individual that maybe has an immune response, such that the ACTH receptors are stimulated. I just made that up. Okay? And so here, if you sampled the blood chemistry from someone, you would expect to see low ACTH levels, low CRH levels, but you should see really high, say, cortisol levels, right? Does this way to track things make sense to folks? Am I following this? Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Charles.
I was wondering if that was
Can be. It doesn't necessarily have to be the antibody stimulation, but it can be. So anything that's going to cause elevated cortisol, and we'll get to it, can manifest itself as a Cushingoid syndrome. Yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah, go ahead, Serena. a lot of, you can try to do some pharmacological intervention, but it doesn't do a very good penetration of it. And sometimes the cells can adapt. And so, if someone's refractory to those treatments, then removal is the best way to go, right? All right. Okay, but everybody understands how to do this tracking, right? Because this is going to be super helpful when you guys are drawing things out, figuring out how things are disrupted. Okay? All right. Let's talk about some hormones. All right, posterior pituitary. I said there's only 2 hormones that you need to memorize for the posterior pituitary. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin are the 2 that come from the posterior pituitary. All right? And so we'll talk about each one of these in the subsequent slides here. All right, let's first talk about antidiuretic hormone. So diuresis, is that promoting urination or inhibiting it? We talk about diuresis. Promoting it, right? So here, this hormone's involved with inhibiting it in some way. Antidiuretic. The way it does that, and we'll talk about the molecular details of how it affects the kidney when we get into the renal section, but it is going to try to conserve water for the body. So it's going to want to try to resorb water before it makes its way into the urine, to try to minimize the amount of water that's found in the urine. So water resorption. And so if we have less water in the urine, that means less volume of urine and therefore less urine output, right? Okay? Now, what's the stimulus for this? Well, think about having salt water, right, at a certain concentration. If you lose a lot of water, say dehydration, what happens to this concentration of salt in that water? Does it go up or down? Does it become more salty or less salty if you take only water out? More salty, right? Yeah, so I saw you guys mouthing the word more, right? So if you just take water out, so if you boil salt water, right, it becomes saltier, right? So that's kind of like the state of dehydration. What we say is happening in the body is that the osmolarity is increasing, right? Osmolarity is measuring how much solute is in a solution. So here, if we increase the amount of salt per amount of solution, like taking water out and leaving the salt in there, osmolarity goes up. So how can we dilute that salt water again? We can add water to it. That's pretty much what ADH is trying to do, right? And so here, it is trying to conserve water so that elevated osmolarity gets reversed so that we have normal or isoosmotic conditions again. Sorry, go ahead, Charles. No, that's mineralocorticoids. We're going to talk about that. This one is specifically looking at water. Not ADH. ADH works on aquaporins, which are water channels. We'll talk more about this in the kidneys. Yep. Yeah. Yep. All right. So here, if someone has a problem with ADH, right, what's going to happen to their urine output? It goes up, right? Because here we're no longer conserving water, which means more water is found in urine, which means there's increased urine output, right? Okay? What that means, that's a type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus, right? And so that is a problem with ADH coming from the posterior pituitary. Okay? So what's the target here of this hormone? It's what? Kidneys. All right? Where is it released from? So which part of the pituitary? Posterior pituitary. Okay? And then you're going to want to know also the function. All right? So if we conserve water, that means that we're going to maintain blood volume, which means that we're going to maintain blood pressure. So one of the things is that high blood pressure is going to inhibit release of ADH, right? Because here, if we have really high blood pressure, one of the reasons for that could be because we have increased blood volume. In order to decrease it, we're going to want to reduce that blood volume, and we can do that by not conserving water, by getting water out of the body, right? And so one of the mechanisms or stimuli that inhibits release of ADH is high blood pressure. Okay. Now, here, low blood pressure can cause ADH release to restore blood pressure, is the other way to think about this, right? All right, so let's talk about the other posterior pituitary hormone. That's oxytocin. Some of what we talked about with oxytocin is as a neurotransmitter. Here, we're talking about it as a hormone. It's released in the bloodstream. You guys have a question there? Okay. This is released in bonding events. It's involved with contraction of the uterus. So if you remember when we talked about positive feedback, such as parturition or giving birth, the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, which causes stretching. This sends signals up to the hypothalamus, which causes oxytocin to be released. And then that oxytocin induces more uterine contractions to promote the pushing of the head of the baby against the cervix again, which feeds forward in kind of a snowball effect until an ultimate goal is reached. In that case, it's going to be the birth of the baby. It's also involved with mammary tissue and milk letdown, so lactation, so feeding. So it turns out the signal for that's coming from suckling of the baby to release oxytocin. It's not the only hormone involved, though, in lactation, as we'll see. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the reproduction section. Sorry, go ahead, Sabrina. Say it again, the first. Mm-hmm. It could be, but there's other hormones involved, like prolactin, and those are two major ones. And I'm blanking on progesterone or estrogen also is involved there. But prolactin, oxytocin. Oxytocin, the main stimulus from what I've read about is suckling of the baby to cause increased firing to stimulate the manufacturing of oxytocin. All right. Two hormones from the posterior pituitary, right? Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. Okay? All right, so here the release is coming from the posterior pituitary. Target structures you should know, as well as the effects of these hormones. The anterior pituitary has a lot more hormones coming from it, right? So here, if you look at these, we talked a little bit about growth hormone. We talked a little bit about ACTH. We also have thyroid stimulating hormone. We also have gonadotropins, whose targets are going to be the gonads, testes, and ovaries. We also have prolactin, which I mentioned a little bit with milk letdown, lactation. And then something called melanocyte stimulating hormone, which we won't really talk about. A lot of these hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary, you should know what the targets are, and then also what the hormones released from those targets are going to be and their effects. And so we'll talk about those each in turn. All right, so maybe before we continue on with looking at the rest of the hormones, let's take a 5-minute break. And then after the break, we'll take a look at some of these other hormones, starting off with the anterior pituitary gland. All right, so let's continue our discussion here. Before we do, I just wanted to point out, because I think it's really helpful for you guys studying. I know I put this in an announcement on Blackboard, but there is a table for you guys to fill out of all the hormones, where that hormone's secreted from, the target organ, and its function. So be sure to take a look at this table, be able to fill it out. All right? So that's up under, if you look under additional lecture resources, you're going to find it down here as the endocrine table. Yeah. I'm fine with abbreviations up to this point. You know, I think that's fine for me. I'm more concerned with you guys knowing the relationships between these hormones. What stimulates the release of what? You know, out there in the health field, you should know what the actual name is, because there's, in some cases, multiple names for the same hormone. So an example is ADH. Do you guys have a question there? So ADH, another name for it is vasopressin. So if you guys go and do healthcare in like the UK, they call it more often vasopressin over there. Okay. All right. So there's multiple names for these hormones. So, you know, knowing the name is going to be helpful, because sometimes, you know, that comes up. All right. Okay. All right. So here we've kind of talked about this already, that we have this axis or a system of hormones where a hormone from one structure causes release of hormone from another structure. So here we have releasing hormones. So we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone. That causes release of hormones from the anterior pituitary, respectively. And then those hormones from the anterior pituitary have target structures. Okay? They're going to cause release of other hormones from those target structures. And then those hormones are going to have a variety of effects on target tissues. So what you want to be able to do is understand, okay, well, you know, if a tissue's responding, it has to have what on its cells in order to respond? What does it have to have? Receptors for it, right? So here, where are the receptors for CRH? They have to be found in the pituitary, right? Okay. Where's the receptors for TRH? That should be found in the pituitary. Where are the receptors for TSH? Thyroid gland, right? Does that make sense to folks? In order for a gland or a tissue to respond, it has to have the receptors for it. Okay? All right. So anterior pituitary, first hormone we're going to look at is prolactin. It's involved with lactation. Oops. All right? And so here, prolactin's involved with actual milk formation. Oxytocin's more involved with the actual milk release, letdown. All right? Some other complicated things that go on that we'll talk about when we get to reproductive section. All right? But for right now, that's all you need to know. Okay? All right. All right, so the next one are gonadotropes. Okay? Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, LH and FSH. Their targets are going to be the ovaries and testes in females and males, respectively. Okay? So here with the ovaries, FSH is involved with follicle maturation. So follicles are eventually going to give rise, release the oocyte, okay, the egg, from the ovary. Also a little bit involved with estrogen production. So remember that steroid hormones, sex hormones come from the adrenal gland. Most of them come from these gonads, testes and ovaries. All right? Most of the sex hormones are coming from these gonads. FSH is involved with sperm production. You're going to see here that LH is more involved with promoting production of sex hormones from these structures. So LH is more involved with this ovulation and an estrogen and progesterone production. So the actual release of the oocyte from the ovary into the fallopian tube. In the testes, that's involved with promoting androgen formation, particularly testosterone. So LH is promoting the release of testosterone from testes. Okay? Is that making sense to folks? We'll talk more about this in 233 next quarter when we get to reproduction. Okay? Yeah.
So I know that the kind of hormone will stimulate related cells to testosterone and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So will something like how does that interfere with, I know that will also
HCG, I think there's not a lot of clear literature on that. Yeah, I've looked into it, and there's a lot of research that has questions unanswered. It's a good question. All right, so next hormone from the anterior pituitary, we ran into this in the example I showed you guys, ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. So here, remember, CRH is coming from the hypothalamus to cause release of ACTH, which is then going to cause release of hormones from the adrenal cortex. So remember I told you the adrenal gland was like a hat. The interior of that hat was the medulla. The exterior is the cortex. So we're talking about now releasing from the exterior part of the adrenal gland, the cortex. And this ACTH, it stimulates the release of glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, like we saw. But the other things other type of hormones that causes the release of are mineralocorticoids. Okay? These are involved with minerals, hence the name, such as sodium. All right? And we're going to talk about these in just a second. Now, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, all of these hormones that are coming from the adrenal cortex are steroid hormones, which means the receptors for these hormones are located where? Are they in the cell or embedded in the membrane? They're steroid hormones. In the cell, intracellular, right? They're lipid soluble. So these receptors are inside the target or effector cells. All right? So ACTH, the target structure is the adrenal cortex, is promoting the release of corticoids, glucocorticoids. All right? Oops. And then we also have mineralocorticoids that are released. Okay, so both of those. Cortisol, glucocorticoids, the initial response that causes this release, and I'll get to your question in just a second, is stress. All right? Initial response is stress. What do glucocorticoids do? All right, we're going to talk about that. And also mineralocorticoids. Okay? Sorry, go ahead, Sabrina. Yes, it is. So, corticosterone is another one, so some other animals other than us, that's a primary glucocorticoid release. For us, cortisol is a major one. Has a major effects, I should say. All right, so we're just focusing on the anterior pituitary. We're going to follow up with some of the target structures in just a second. So another hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary is a growth hormone. It's involved with a lot of metabolic actions. So it's involved with promoting the growth of a lot of structures, including skeletal muscle, bone, and cartilage. Right? So here, it's going to be increasing the formation. So if it's increasing the formation of something, we say that that's going to be anabolic, right? It's building something up. Catabolic is breaking it down. So here, growth hormone is really anabolic in its actions, right? So we do protein synthesis, right? Building protein. Now, one of the few catabolic things it does is that it does break down a bit of adipose tissue, okay? And so here, instead of using glucose, cells use fatty acids. Right. Overall, the goal here is to promote growth of bones, skeletal muscle, and cartilage. And if you remember back to 231, when we talked about bone tissue, right, the elongation of long bones in children is primarily stimulated by growth hormone. And then excess growth hormone in adults led to acromegaly, that disease, right? So Andre the Giant had acromegaly. Now, one of the other targets here of growth hormone, in addition to, say, a lot of the skeletal muscle and so forth, is the liver that releases some hormones that are called insulin-like growth factors, IGFs. Another name for them are somatomedins. I prefer to use the words IGF. All right? So IGFs are involved with growth of the skeletal muscle, cartilage, and many other tissues. So they promote growth along with the growth hormone directly. All right? Now, here, if we want to put brakes on the system, notice that these IGFs, they get to a certain level, and they stimulate the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone, right? It's going to put the brakes on releasing of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. The other thing that they do is they inhibit release of growth hormone releasing hormone. So they're taking the foot off the gas and putting the foot on the brake, right, in order to shut down the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Everybody follow me on that? Okay. This is where having this drawn out, like in this sketch that I showed you guys earlier, really helps with understanding how the system functions, and you can understand how that system is going to be disrupted, right, if something happens to it. All right. So here it's also involved with glycogen breakdown, and that means that what's happening with the glucose level, if we're breaking down glycogen in the liver, the blood glucose level, is that going up or down? Should be going up, because remember, glycogen is just a series of glucose molecules, and if we start breaking that glycogen apart, we're going to be releasing glucose molecules that can be released into the blood, and therefore elevate blood glucose levels. Now, it's not the main hormone that does that, though. All right? So here's insulin-like growth factors. They're released from the liver, like I said. They're going to be stimulating actions for growth, and then in particular skeletal muscle and bone. So if we're stimulating bone growth, what cells are being stimulated for that? What cells in the bone do the building? Osteoblasts, right? Okay? So here, like I said, when we talk about these systems of the body, they don't operate in isolation. They impact other systems of the body. So you have to remember some of those critical features for those other systems. All right. So here they're going to, in order to increase muscle growth, right? A lot of skeletal muscle is made up of proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. So not surprisingly, they're going to promote the increase in uptake of amino acids. All right. So formation of collagen and allow for deposition, we talked about that. main cells in bone that are involved with deposition were the osteoblasts that you guys remember. Okay? Right. So all of this is about building bone, building skeletal muscle, and cartilage and the connecting tissue around bone and skeletal muscle. All right? Is that making sense to folks? Growth hormone, its major physiological effect is really building bone and skeletal muscle. All right. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Right? So that's being released from the anterior pituitary. Okay? Its major target is going to be the thyroid gland. All right? And thyroid hormones. Okay? And so here, the main thyroid hormone, it's made up of iodine, or it has iodine in it. Some of those thyroid hormones coming from the thyroid gland have 3 iodine molecules, hence they're called T3. Some are called T4. Okay? So T3 and T4 are referring to thyroid hormone that's coming from the thyroid gland. Thyroid TSH is coming from where? Where's that coming from? Anterior pituitary. Right? Okay, so if you remember back to bone, another hormone that comes from there is calcitonin, which is involved with bone deposition. Right? So we talked about parathyroid hormones involved with resorption, and then calcitonin's involved with deposition. Right? And so here, the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, they require iodine. So if you don't have enough iodine, what happens to the thyroid hormone levels? What do you guys think? They go up or down? They should go down, right? We don't have enough iodine in order to make an active form of thyroid hormone. Okay? And so here, an iodine deficiency, that can cause the thyroid gland to try to compensate by increasing its mass. So it's trying to make more thyroid hormone. So it means that thyroid gets larger, and therefore it causes hypothyroidism, right? Now you can also get hypothyroidism, right, if you have too much iodine as well, right? So you're increasing the amount of iodine, right? So you're increasing the output from that gland, and so it can increase there as well. So a lot of times glands or tissues increase in size because they have either increased stimulation of that gland or tissue, or there's an increased demand put on it, right? This should sound familiar because we saw this when we talked about bone tissue, right? The increased demand on the bone, what happens to the bone density? It goes up, right? If we decrease demand on the bone density decreases. Same thing happens a lot with these endocrine glands. Sorry, go ahead, Sabrina. Yeah, so iodine levels, you can get hyperthyroidism, like I said, if you have a deficiency or if you have too much. Yeah. You can. You know, it depends upon the mechanism. Yeah, so the details there we can talk about a little bit more. We don't have time to go into details now. But hyperthyroidism, generally that can be stimulated by autoimmune response, stimulating the thyroid gland, right? And so that's called Graves' disease, okay? And once again, like I told you guys, if you increase the stimulation or demand on a tissue, it increases in size. So hyper means that it's elevated in size. Hypo means that it's decreased in size. You have decreased demand or decreased stimulation of that gland. Okay? So calcitonin is the opposite of parathyroid hormone, basically. Right? It's stimulated, it's released when calcium levels in blood are too high. And so we need to make deposits of calcium into bone. So you have osteoblasts being stimulated, right? To do that deposition, right? PTH, on the other hand, is inhibited in order for you not making withdrawals while you're trying to deposit the calcium, right? Okay? Ultimately, what's going to happen is that blood calcium levels are going to go down. All right. So here, this is somewhat what I was talking about with T3 and T4. You can see the structures over there. You don't have to memorize them. I'm just putting them up there for you guys to take a look at them. Now, even though these T3 and T4 are somewhat amino acid based, it turns out they use the same mechanism as lipid-soluble hormones, which means the receptor is membrane bound or inside the cell. Inside the cell. So the thyroid receptor is actually intracellular. Okay. All right. So what does it do? Thyroid hormones are involved with increasing metabolism, metabolic rate. So increased protein synthesis, gene activation goes up, you get more ATP production, body heat, and that results in increased body heat. Generally, increased thyroid levels, such as with hyperthyroidism, individuals have difficulty sleeping. Right? So because iodine is required for manufacture, I talked about this already, you can get a goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid gland. All right? So what ends up happening is that the pathway to synthesize these thyroid hormones gets to a point where it doesn't have enough iodine to complete the process. So it continues trying to make thyroid hormone, but it doesn't have all the building blocks to complete it. And so it continues to get larger and larger in an attempt to try to reverse, the deficiency of thyroid hormone. Go ahead, Sabrina. So here, if Graves' disease generally is involved with stimulating the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. In order to try to minimize that, you minimize the amount of tissue. And so here, without removing the tissue, if the thyroid hormone levels are way up here, and you take out some of that tissue, what should happen to those thyroid levels? They should kind of go back down to where they should be normally. Does that make sense? All right. Okay, so this is just a graph or a map showing different areas where we have the right amount, optimal amount of iodine, deficiency, and risk of hyperthyroidism due to too much iodine, right? And so you can see that we have various areas. A lot of the places that have deficiencies are going to be in a lot of third world countries. Yeah. All right, so we talked about parathyroid hormone in 231. I've mentioned it several times already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the major targets are the bones, like we talked about, okay? The GI tract for absorbing calcium, and then also kidneys for making sure that we conserve as much calcium as possible so we don't excrete it in urine, okay? The ultimate goal here is to increase the amount of blood calcium, right? Hopefully that makes sense to folks. All right. So let's talk about one of the first, structures outside of the thyroid here and the pituitary, which is the pancreas. The pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine tissue. It has both functions. The endocrine function is housed in these islets of Langerhans, these kind of islands you see in the pancreatic tissue. The exocrine function is all of this tissue that surrounds those islets. So the exocrine is involved with secreting enzymes into the intestines, the digestive tract. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the digestive system. We're going to focus on the islets of Langerhans. Two major cells to know here are going to be the alpha cells and the beta cells. The alpha cells secrete a hormone called glucagon, and the beta cells secrete a hormone called insulin. Okay? All right? Now, insulin's involved with trying to lower blood glucose levels. All right? Glucagon's the opposite. It's trying to actually increase blood glucose levels. So here, what's the stimulus that causes glucagon to be released? Well, if blood glucose is too low, then glucagon gets released to try to elevate it. How does it do that? Well, remember, one of the stores of glucose is glycogen. So what does it do? It promotes the breakdown of glycogen so that glucose gets released into the bloodstream to try to restore blood glucose levels. Insulin, produced by beta cells, is released when there's too high a blood glucose, or blood glucose levels spike. And what it's going to do is going to cause its target cells to insert a glucose transporter so that glucose gets transported out of the blood into that target cell. Many of those cells, there's a lot of different effectors, different tissues, but one of the major ones is skeletal muscle and the liver. Okay? So if glucose is being taken out of the blood glucose levels are being lowered, right? Okay? So that's mainly how insulin is functioning. Insulin and glucagon, right, operate antagonistically, right? So one's involved with lowering blood glucose, one's involved with raising blood glucose. Everybody understand what I'm talking about there? Okay? Okay, so you guys probably have heard a little bit about diabetes. We talked about diabetes insipidus, which is ADH deficiency. Insulin hyposecretion. So if we have too little insulin being released, what is that doing to blood glucose levels? Staying elevated, not decreasing as much. Most likely going up, right? That can cause all sorts of problems in the body because glucose isn't getting into certain cells. And glucose is a energy storage molecule. So here, diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is when there's an autoimmune condition in which the immune cells attack the beta cells so that the beta cells are diminished so that they can't release insulin. And so here, the major treatment here is to inject insulin or have an insulin pump to replace the insulin that can't be released by the beta cells because they're being attacked by the immune system. All right? That's different than if insulin can be released from the beta cells, but the target effectors, the insulin receptor on the target tissues, doesn't respond. So here, type 2 diabetes is that insulin gets released, but the target tissues don't respond to the insulin, meaning that they don't do a good job of taking up the blood glucose. And so here, exercise, diet, weight loss, you can actually reverse this condition with some of these treatments. Gastric bypass can also reverse this. So it's pretty amazing, and the mechanism's not quite understood, but you can reverse, in some cases, within hours, type 2 diabetes with gastric bypass surgery, which is pretty amazing. All right? Everybody clear on the difference between type 1 and type 2? Insulin not secreted here, or not as much. Insulin is secreted, but the ability of the effectors to respond is somehow being interfered with. Okay? All right. So we've talked a little bit about the adrenal glands already. Remember the medulla inside of that hat is doing epinephrine, norepinephrine. The cortex are dealing with all those corticoids. Gonatocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and glucocorticoids. Main glucocorticoid we've talked about is cortisol. Mineralocorticoid, which we'll talk about, the main one is aldosterone. And gonatocorticoids, remember the major structures that release these are testes and ovaries. A little bit comes from here, not much. All right? All of these are steroid hormones, meaning that they are what? Water or lipid soluble. Lipid soluble, absolutely. Okay? All right. So the medulla, like we talked about, hopefully this is review for folks. It's a sympathetic nervous system. And the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, right? That causes epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released into the bloodstream. That was a sympathetic response, right? Fight or flight. Hopefully that's ringing a bell for folks, right? Okay, good. The adrenal cortex, okay? So if we look at this hat, the medulla is the interior, the cortex is the outer portion, okay? And coming from the cortex are all our mineralocorticoids, our glucocorticoids, and our androgens. Glucocorticoids include cortisol, corticosterone, cortisone, right? Mineralocorticoids, there's a few of them as well. The major one is something called aldosterone, which is involved with sodium maintenance. Okay? There's some gonatocorticoids, but the major tissues that secrete these are testes and ovaries. Okay. So mineralocorticoids, they're involved with water and electrolyte balance. The major one here is aldosterone. Okay? If it's involved with electrolyte balance, what do you think the target's going to be here? So what's involved with, say, fluid? Maintenance of fluid in our bodies. Kidney. Yep. Kidney. Glucocorticoids have a whole bunch of effects in the body, right? They regulate carbohydrate metabolism, protein and fat metabolism. Major one's cortisol here. All right. So like I said, aldosterone's a major sodium. It regulates sodium, reabsorption of sodium. So here, the sodium-potassium balance, okay? If it's going to be disrupted, that's going to be detected, and you're going to get stimulation of the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. The major target are the kidneys, and you're going to get sodium reabsorption, potassium secretion, and so here, if you're getting sodium reabsorption, you're maintaining the osmolarity of tissues, okay? So here, there's osmoreceptors that detect osmolarity. And if the sodium levels are too low, they get triggered, and that's going to cause the release of aldosterone, mineralocorticoids, to make sure that system is maintained. Okay? Now, if sodium gets reabsorbed, eventually it gets too high a little bit, and that causes ADH to be released so that water then gets reabsorbed via ADH. Okay? So here, what ends up happening is water follows the sodium being reabsorbed in the kidney. And we'll talk more about the system when we get into the kidney, the renal system. For right now, you need to focus on aldosterone's focuses on sodium. Okay, so cortisol, take home from this slide is that there is without any other perturbation like stress, it actually spikes early in the morning and goes down throughout the day. Cortisol is released in response to stress, so prolonged stress can have disastrous effects because what does cortisol do? Well, it promotes a lot of activities such as fat distribution, and then also one of the benefits, though, is that it suppresses the immune system, so an inflammatory response. So maybe you guys have heard of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, right? Folks have heard of those? So here, glucocorticoids are steroidal anti-inflammatories. They suppress the inflammatory response. The drawback is that it can cause effects such as osteoporosis, so bone thinning, and then also muscle breakdown, and then also fat deposition. So there's a syndrome where you can get excess glucocorticoids, cortisol, coming from the adrenal gland. It's called Cushing's syndrome. And individuals with Cushing's syndrome have fat depositions on their kind of the back of their upper part of their back and their neck, and their limbs have very little fat, so they have very thin legs. All right? And so individuals with Cushing's syndrome look like that. All right? So the benefit here, okay, is that you suppress the inflammatory response, but the drawback is you cause damage to a lot of these other structures. Everybody following me on that? Okay. Okay. So we'll talk more about these reproductive organs. We've talked enough about these to know that LH is more involved with promoting the sex steroid formation. FSH is a little bit more involved with promoting the formation of the gametes, so oocytes and sperm. Okay? All right. So I know that's a lot of information for you guys. Okay? It's recorded, so hopefully you guys can go back and take a look at the recording. Write things out in that table that I showed you guys, and then you guys have opportunities in lab to study these. Okay? So take advantage of that opportunity. So at the very end here is where I have the review questions to take a look at. All right? Okay, so I'll see you guys there in lab at noon. All right? And for the rest of the folks, have a great weekend and be safe out there.